Welcome to Front and Center, from political battlefields to cooperative playing fields. Hello, I'm Michael Maxetti. Today, my partner Steve and I are having a conversation to help us answer the question, how do we get government on the side of the people? And to do that, one of the most important things that we must do is to begin to cooperate and have conversations that can rehumanize each other so that we can get off of those battlefields, get off of the blue team and the red team, and try to get on to at least a playing field that we can begin to cooperate. So before we go any further, though, I'd like to turn it over to my partner, Steve, to make an appropriate introduction to our guest today. Steve?
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, and welcome, Nancy. Nancy Vogl was a founding member of one of the first feminist rock bands in the 1970s Bay Area women's music scene. She played bass at the first International Women's Rock Festival in Germany in 1981. She's had the good fortune to have had worked and studied with James and Grace Lee Boggs as mentors and friends. We'll hear more about the Boggses as we continue with the conversation. She's been a professional in youth development. She served on the State Superintendent's Task Force on Service Learning for the California Department of Education and as a youth service director for the Volunteer Center of Sonoma County. She was co-director and leadership coach for Sonoma's LGBTQI support group and represented Northern California as a Rotary Foundation Peace Ambassador in Barcelona, Spain. She is currently a board member of the up-and-coming Common Sense Party. So welcome, Nancy.
Thank you. It's a little weird to hear all that all at one time.
I know, it's hard. That's the official bio, but really the reason why we have you here is that in these times of divisiveness and separation, I think it's really so important to integrate truth from all sides. And one of our greatest resources are those individuals who've been really in the political scene on many different sides over time. And I think you've navigated that divide, and I think you have the capacity to see things from a number of different perspectives and a unique and diverse political history. So why don't we begin there? Let's talk a little bit about your own political history, where you grew up, what your political inclinations were when you were younger, and how that transformed over time.
Sure. Well, both my parents were Republicans during the 50s, and with Reagan, they were enthralled with Reagan. But by the time the Iran-Contra situation came around, my dad was disgusted. And so, I was really proud of him. He was a career Army. So I was born in Turkey. He was stationed overseas. We lived there. And that overseas experience impacted the family immeasurably. And because my mom was living in a third world country from 1949 to 52. So it left a lot of impressions into the family. But I loved, my dad said that he, the guy, Iran, he was right on the tip of my tongue, and now I've blocked his name out, was a disgrace to the uniform, the guy who, the officer.
Oliver North.
Oliver North,
Oliver
yes,
North.
thank you very much.
Yeah.
So he really felt that he was seeing that things were being done that were untoward. And so we ended up having, some wonderful conversations later on. So justice, integrity, those values were really important in growing up. My dad had worked he worked his way through Morgan Park Military Academy in Chicago because his older brother had died in World War I, and so he wanted to be in the Army. So my grandmother couldn't afford it, so he worked in the kitchen when he went to the military academy. And all the other boys called him Jew boy, gave him the worst jobs to do. He would just describe as miserable being at a hot Chicago kitchen and having to do some of the work that they didn't want to do. So for him, respecting work respecting workers and respecting people who were in relationship to you was primary, was absolutely a foundation principle in our home. And then my mom had been in the theater in Chicago, and so obviously had known lots of lesbians and gays in the theater, and so took a very liberal and very compassionate view. So I had a lot of support growing up. I didn't come out until, I mean, I came out to her, I suppose, in 1968 or 69, I guess, but she probably had known, you know, before then. So from there, I graduated right into feminism and the women's movement. So by 1969, I had already developed some friendships and was looking with a more critical eye at some of the cultural things that I saw, and been exposed, you know, the first gay parade, not first, but the big gay parade in 1969 in LA was revolutionary for me to be so isolated, to be internally oppressed as I was, and then for the first time to see a hill, and as far as the eye could see were all gays marching, gays and lesbians marching. This was a profound moment because the visibility of that was transformational. So from there, I moved up to Berkeley, and didn't go to Berkeley, but I went to the town of Berkeley, which was a hotbed of ideas and debates and action and excitement and creativity. And so I lived in Berkeley from 73 to 84, about, before I moved up here to Sonoma County.
Interesting.
Okay, that was too long. Sorry.
No. That we want to hear you talk, because it's so interesting to see how the seeds of integrity, let's say political integrity, develop when somebody is willing to go, you know, I've changed my viewpoint because of this integrity issue that came up. So when Oliver North went south, that your dad actually made a change.
Well, for him, again, it was the principle. It wasn't the winning. It was the principle of things. And that's what I always respected about him.
So how did you get involved or get connected with James and Grace Lee Boggs? And for people who don't know who they were, there's a wonderful documentary on Grace Lee Boggs. What's the documentary called?
American Revolutionary, I think.
American Revolutionary. And it's really about her evolution as a revolutionary.
Really.
So how did you connect with her, and what was it that attracted you to the Boggs' work? And maybe say a little bit about that.
Well, let's see. So I moved into a big house of women. I think it was the old governor's mansion in Berkeley, and it was the old governor's mansion from before the turn of the century. And so there were about 13 or 14 of us living there in a big collective. And one of the people said, hey, there's going to be a meeting next week. Some musicians, we want to like do a women's music collective. And so I said, well, that sounds great. And so that next Wednesday, I moved in on a Friday or something, and the next Wednesday we had our first meeting. And from that, we became a band. And so we started playing. We played for different benefits and outdoor marches. And so from there, we made an album. And then from there, we toured with the album. So we were on tour in Detroit in 1978. And we played in a bar. Did I ever tell you this? I mean, maybe I already said this, but.
No, you haven't.
It's a new story for me.
Okay.
And so for our audience.
We were in a bar in Cleveland, because we played a women's bar in Cleveland. And so in the restroom, when you shut the door, there was a sign, a little 8.5 by 11 mimeograph, probably is what it was. But it said, what America do you want to live in? Or something similar. And I said, well, that's interesting. What's that about? And the language that they used, the vision of the United States that they presented was exactly the nation that I wanted to live in, that was based on integrity, based on respect, based on appreciating all the communities that had created the nation itself. And so I said, man, I got to find these people. So I there were a lot of them, so I didn't feel bad about taking, but I folded it, I put it in my pocket. And our next town was Detroit, because we were going to play a gig there. And so I walked in to the bar or wherever it was, and there were people selling books right at the front of the show. And sure enough, it was the same group. So they were selling Jimmy and Grace's book. And I was ecstatic because I had found the people that had written all this beautiful language. So then I became involved with the Detroit folks who were selling, and they had a group there. I met Jimmy and Grace. And from then on, I came home. Some other people knew about Jimmy and Grace, and we did a study group on revolution and evolution in the 20th century. I think they came out for a week or two. And every night, you know, from, I don't know, 4 to 10 or something, we just went through the book and talked about ideas, and my brain hurt. To be honest, it's the first time my brain ever hurt. I mean, you can go to, you know, you can go work in the garden. You can maybe, I don't know, go play baseball or something and your muscles hurt. But this was the first time my brain hurt, really. After that, the inquiry and the challenges by Jimmy and Grace, I mean, they didn't hold anything back. I mean, if they thought your comment was undeveloped, they would let you know. And so that was a profound experience for me, to be in that intellectual environment with people who had already been in the movement. And I had my own ideologically pure ideas from being a lesbian, feminist, and socialist, not, I guess, a classical socialist, but we who were more towards that nonprofit type view. So we were lesbian, feminist, socialists. And so I had my positioned views, but then to be exposed to a whole other realm of the union work during the 30s, and the auto plants, and the racism, and the whole world that they had existed in before I was even around, was such a profound humbling for me. It was a really, really important developmental stage for me, because I opened my mind in a new way that was really healthy, very healthy.
Let me interject something here. When people, and I hope they truly go and look up and watch The American Revolutionary, The Evolution of Grace Lee Boggs. That's the name when people, it's on YouTube and other platforms, I'm sure. But you're actually in that movie in a few scenes there at length. Were those scenes in Berkeley when you were questioning Grace on some topics?
No, in 1986, we realized that Jimmy and Grace were getting older. I mean, they're in their 60s, I guess, but Lyman, Freddie's husband, had already died. And so Freddie was a little bit older, Freddie Payne, who's also in the book. They were 4 of them. And so we started thinking, wow, somebody needs to document this before they're gone. And so Francis Reed from Iris Films in Berkeley got a film crew together, and we got some funding, and we flew to Maine and went to Sutton Island on Maine, which Conversations in Maine. They would go there during the summer, and they would invite people that they knew, and they would discuss politics for the month of August. And they would just hone in and dive deep on the United States and what it means to be here in this country, what it means to create structures of governance and have conversations that you don't have time to just get into. And so we went there and we filmed for about a week or 10 days. And then we kept all the tapes just because it was really for posterity or for some other time. And then when Grace Lee, there's another Grace Lee who did this movie of Grace Lee Boggs, right, but there's a whole story in that. We told her about the film and the films that we had. And then Francis gave her all of the film, and there were hours and hours and hours of film. So I think I have about a second and a half. It's maybe a second and 3/4.
You have more than that. You have more than that. But I'd like to back up though and drill into something, because that flyer that you politely took one of from the back of that, in that restroom, that led you to the Boggs and Detroit, the question was asked, what America do you want to live in? And that is a key question that is very similar to part of the underpinnings to our show and the intent of our show, which is to help us bring forth and write a new story that it's specifically about how can we create a more beautiful and just world that our hearts know is possible.
I love that quote, by the way.
Yeah, and that originally, with the exception we added, and just comes from Charles Eisenstein, which we interviewed in earlier. But what America do you want to live in? That is such an important question that parallels to the heart of what kind of a world do we want to live in? And that's the purpose of our conversation really today, is to get into that. I'd like to ask you about what are some of the specifics that you could recall from your time with James and Grace Lee Boggs in the conversations that were about consciousness and the evolution of freedom. What has led you then to what do you recall from that? And then how did you move forward to where you now wanted to get re-engaged in politics at this time in your life and to get back on track to helping create that vision and answer that question, what America do we want to live in? What kind of America do we want to live in?
Wow.
Big question, two of them.
Yeah, boy, that's
Well, let's focus on just what is your recollections from Boggs that helped you challenge your thinking of what kind of America do we want to live in?
well, Grace, of course, had her PhD in Hegel's theory of contradictions. So that experience of being around those conversations, it always challenged the listener or the participant to go underneath whatever the conflict was and say, what's the fundamental contradiction in this conversation that we're really discussing? And then, of course, once you get to that fundamental contradiction, the tension that's really there, then, of course, it opens up into another tension. And so one of the things that they were adamant about is that something that's created at a particular time, you can have a brilliant theory, and it's a brilliant theory for that time. But 20 years later, when the culture changes, perhaps that theory no longer is appropriate to that particular time in history. And so it allowed me to understand what dogma is and being ideologically positioned such that you hold on to your position because you think you're right, regardless of the fact that there's new information, or that the world has changed, or the culture has changed, whatever. And so that experience set me on a different way of participating in my environment, because I'm looking at what's there, what's the fundamental tension that's causing whatever is going on, what's a potential solution, and that what is wanted and needed for that particular issue. And so that's the way I frame moving in the world now. And it seems to work for me. I mean, I wish I were more articulate about it, but that is one fundamental thing. Certainly, racism was deeply rooted in everything they did. Their story is unique because James Boggs was from Marion Junction, Alabama. He came from a sharecropping family. He married Grace Boggs, who's a Bryn Mawr PhD, and their two best friends, Lyman Payne was a blue blood from the Mayflower, Staten Island, Maine, and Freddie Payne, his wife, came to New York in one summer where they took garment workers from the garment workers in New York, in the New York garment district. She was a working class Jew in the garment district, and she had a summer at Bryn Mawr and met Grace. So the four of them had the most remarkable perceptions about living in the United States. And so from that, it infused also everything we did, because one view is never going to be the answer to anything. And so when you harness the wisdom from different perspectives and different experiences, you increase the capacity for change, because you've gotten the best ideas and you create a new whole. And so that was just important for me.
Wow, that's such another way to say seeking the whole truth together. One of the things that we're trying to do that will, that's beautiful. Steve, I know you actually interviewed the boxer.
Yeah, I
Oh,
had
really?
good
When?
in 1980.
Oh,
I had
okay.
a magazine called Pathways Magazine. My good friend Marilyn Becker was worked with them for many
Mhm.
years.
That name
Yeah,
sounds familiar.
yeah, Marilyn Becca Kobliska was her
Mhm.
last name. And anyway, so I was blown away. I just looked at some of my notes from, I read the interview, and it could have been done yesterday here.
Mhm.
The consciousness that they had, for example, uh, the consciousness and conscience, moving from consciousness, which is how we've been wronged by these external forces, to conscience, which is struggling with the enemy within.
Mhm.
And in a certain regard, listening to James, and in a certain, it's really kind of funny, but embedded in this left-wing progressive notion were some very conservative values. The conservative values of responsibility for oneself
Mhm.
and all of that. And it's very fresh today. They were way ahead of their time because of how they were integrating
Mhm.
these different perspectives. Uh,
And in some ways, I think rejected by some of the left because it did sound too conservative, and it's challenging to talk about. There's a very I don't want to say sweet spot because it's not, but it's a very precarious balance between victimization and internalized oppression. And so it's just and then personal responsibility. It's a very, very precarious line. And so Jimmy would challenge, I mean, one example I think that they would use is that we have a healthcare system that does not heal people. It applies remedies to symptoms. So we don't have really a health system. But then on the other hand, Jimmy would say, but then we should not be eating junk food. So, I mean, we should keep our bodies healthy.
yeah.
And so is it someone's fault that we're not eating healthy food? Now, you can go into prices and absolutely, and the food deserts in African-American communities. I know all of that is true, but the idea that we have as much personal responsibility to step up as we are being oppressed by the dominant culture, I think that is constantly also in my thinking, because you have to appreciate both sides because they're real. Oppression and racism, it is hardcore, but then internalized oppression is also hardcore, and I've experienced that, and I have censored myself. I have not stood up because I felt less than, and I had my own experience with that. So yeah, so what you bring up is true. They weren't afraid to say what they felt was appropriate.
Exactly, and it was really quite amazing watching that documentary. Grace was a Chinese American, and
Mhm.
yet nobody ever thought of her. I mean, she was just part of the Black community, so
Mhm.
it just there was such a blending of intention and so on. So I
Mhm.
really appreciate how you're talking about the nuance of all of these different viewpoints to bump people out of their ideological structures and rigidity. So now here you are, you're now, fast forward 40 years or so, you're now on the board of the Common Sense Party. So the, how did you get to that perspective, and how has your political perspective developed since the time that you've been involved with the Boggses?
Well, I was doing a lot of community work, so I can't say I've been in politics all this time because I haven't. I've been in community politics.
Yeah.
During the Central American War, there was a heightened paranoia that that what was going on in Central America was going to be transferred to the United States, and that it was happening. And so the idea of assassinations and covert um, covert strategies that were happening would be dangerous to progressives and liberals and radicals for certain. And so the idea was put out by some people, hey, we're talking about changing the United States. What do you do in your own community? And so I took that to heart. And so I had just moved up here. And so I dove into creating community here and worked in the nonprofit community here with agencies and youth development. So rather than take a national view, I was a part of this movement, I guess, to dig down into your own community and see what works and create new relationships here that were authentic relationships, not theoretical.
Nancy,
And so I
let me
did that.
interrupt- Nancy, let me interrupt you for a second. Where is here for the
Oh,
audience?
just Sonoma County, California.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Please, go ahead.
So it wasn't until, I don't know, Mike, I don't know, did you email me or did you message me or something on Facebook? I can't remember how I got connected to Mike again, but we went to high school together. We were from freshman to senior together at South High in Torrance. And so when I started talking to Mike, I was so delighted that he was involved in the same ways that I was, philosophically, in terms of looking at the division and the divisiveness between the right and the left, and the personalization of politics that criminalized each side almost. And so I was intrigued by that. I wanted to know more, and that's when he sent me some information about common sense.
And it was, we reconnected, and to back up a little bit, to add to what Nancy just said, how we met. We actually went to school together for 4 years at South Torrance High School. We were friends, but we were not buddies. We didn't run around in the same social circles, but we served on student council together for basically 3 full years. And I had always had a great deal of respect for Nancy, but we weren't buddies. And I really only saw her after high school and a couple of the class reunions. And so literally from the time we graduated high school, for 50 years,
right?
For 50 years, we went on very separate journeys. And I forget exactly what it was that I got an inkling that your journey was very different than mine, but in many ways paralleled our learning and brought us to a point. And I reached out to you and we had lunch, and that's when we started to explore what your journey had been and where you were intellectually on this issue of our world's politics today and what's happening in our country, and these issues of freedom and equality and justice. And that's when I shared with her that I was part of the leadership team at the Common Sense Party, and explaining to her about that, and then recognizing that part of the evolution of the Common Sense Party needs leadership like what Nancy has in that perspective. And that's where we shared a lot of conversations, and that's where she then joined our advisory board, and where she is now, and has joined us in helping us create the seed that will grow this party. So I'll leave it at that. But
I can really see the threads of the Boggs's influence continuing, because they were very practical. They were very feet on the ground. And so your community involvement in Sonoma County, and actually getting to the nitty-gritty rather than the theoretical, what experience there comes to mind as something that was really a marker or an accomplishment, or something that you went, that was really excellent? There's something in that experience.
I don't know if I can. Yeah, that's hard to say. I mean, we're working with, you have job alikes, in every town you have job alikes. So my cadre was all the youth development people in various youth programs all over town. So I think there was a camaraderie from people who were experiencing the same thing, because to a certain extent, young people are also victimized in adults not crediting them, not giving them enough credit for their intelligence and contribution. And so I got involved in youth service. And so linking young people with authentic community activities that then impacted themselves and impacted them in the future. So I guess the most exciting work was one of the high schools changed their schedule around so that the students didn't go to school on Tuesdays and Thursdays after lunch. They went out into the community. So my job was to place them, and 260 kids would go out to the community Tuesday and Thursday, and then another 250 on Monday and Wednesday. And so they were serving in nonprofit organizations and in elementary schools as mentors and playground assistants. And that was the most remarkable experience I had, being a part of probably, I think there were about 35, 40 agencies that we worked with. And so I got to see how the nonprofit community works and how it serves more people. The sad part about that is that this is probably going to be a topic of conversation at one point, but when the movement came to lower taxes, so what happened is people didn't want to pay retirement for people who worked at the county. So the county budgets of providing health care and student programs and the things that the county used to do, they no longer did it, and it went to the nonprofit community. And so the nonprofit community assumed the role of youth care in all of Sonoma County. And what happens is the reduced taxes then sent that down to the nonprofit organizations, which paid just above living wages, because nonprofit community doesn't have retirement, and they make much less than the private sector, certainly, and government. And so it's something to talk about when we talk about government, what services should be provided and what kind of remuneration should people have. Because right now there's a huge disparity between people who work in the nonprofit community and do the direct service work and a shrinking county budget that now is just administration. So there's good points, and then there's some bad points that came from it too.
That's really very interesting. Go ahead, Michael. You were going to say something.
I was going to say, there's, we could go on in much more length about these topics of government and that about what America do we want to live in. But that leads us, there's two other subjects that I wanted to engage conversation with Nancy and Steve on. And one of those is to have a conversation and try to unpack a little bit of the controversy around critical race theory.
Mm-hmm.
And then also to unpack a little bit around the controversy of genderqueer and the use of pronouns.
Mm-hmm.
And so why don't we save those conversations for the next part of our conversation in a separate segment for those people who want to. I hope people have enjoyed listening to your journey, Nancy, and we'll come back and listen to part 2, where we're going to go into a discussion about critical race theory. So
yeah, well, I appreciate everybody who stuck it out.
and Steve,
so far there's 4 of us.
Okay.
All right, so
but there'll be more.
So with that, if you're watching Front and Center for the first time, we hope that you will go to our locals platform or on Rumble and consider supporting us so that Steve and I can continue our work and continue having conversations with such people as Nancy to bring out areas that need to have more in-depth conversation and to hopefully spark some curiosity in things that you might do. And if you're watching on YouTube or listening to our audio podcasts, either on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or Red Circle, or wherever, please subscribe. Obviously, please like, and of course, please share with your friends and followers. So for the moment, from political battlefields to cooperative playing fields, it's a long journey to the more beautiful and just world our hearts know is possible. Let us go there together, and let's remember the question that led Nancy to the Boggses. what America do you want to live in? Thank you very much.